Selective reading, following only the things which one decides are interesting or central to Sufi or any other kind of knowledge, can produce ludicrous results, if it does anything at all. This has been called making a comb without the teeth. I rather like one story intended to help the learner register the need to attend to all aspects of a teaching story, or of instructions given by an authentic teacher, or even procedures handed down from antiquity. The Honeymoon. A man was seen, dressed in exotic finery, whooping it up in the streets of a city. Someone asked him why he was doing it. "Why not?" he asked. "I am on my honeymoon." "But where's your bride?" "Oh, she's been here once before, so she stayed at home." It has been said that a tactful teacher is no teacher at all. The reputation which some Sufis have traditionally had for being ill-tempered is undoubtedly due to their being primarily concerned with getting their objectives reached, rather than caring what socially sensitive but spiritually dead people might think of them. If we apply the Sufi test to the majority of the people generally accepted as spiritual teachers or mystical masters, there is no doubt that the majority will insist that the Sufis are not spiritual at all, because they equate spirituality with gentleness at all times, while the Sufis will tend to ignore the others as being engaged in social, tribal, community, but not comprehensively spiritual affairs. Tactful Guru. I was talking to a certain world-famous spiritual teacher who was always surrounded by disciples and followers. I realized from what he said that he did not approve of the things people did. In fact, he complained quite a lot about them. They want to have festivals and say, "Of course we must all work for a festival." They feel that they should pray, so they say, "Of course we must all pray now." They come up to me and say, "You must give us a lecture." I said, "Then why don't you tell them just to wait until you do have some teachings for them, until you have the right people at the right place at the right time?" "I have tried that," he said, "but they don't listen, or else they desert me." But how do you square it with your conscience when you find that you are agreeing with all their demands? "We have come to an arrangement. I have got them to agree always to say, 'We do have to have a religious service, don't we?' whenever they want to do something. And I always answer, 'Yes,' loudly, and 'but not yet' under my breath." To me, this comes under the humour of the situation, even if not intended as a joke. People often ask Sufis what is wrong with being cultivated, and why sensitivity should not accompany proper behaviour. The experienced fact is that of priorities. If a house is on fire, you will act accordingly, and your etiquette will be thrown to the winds. This does not mean that you are a bore, or want to be one. We should note, too, that time is lost on ceremonial if something more effective could have been done instead. Action. Nasruddin was sitting at a cafe table gazing at two men by a hole in the road. "What are you thinking, Mullah?" asked a passerby. "How lazy people are. I've been sitting here for 4 hours and I've never taken my eyes off those men. Can you believe that during all that time neither of them has done any work?" There are many jokes about the difference between how the Sufi sees something, the reality, and the preoccupations of most other people surrounding him, the ritual. The Sufi is often the victim of this charade called everyday life. Indeed, he needs a great deal of skill in planning to avoid discomfort and more. The greatest Sufis have been, and most of them still are, venerated and turned almost into objects of worship. One example of misunderstanding, of people craving idolatry, not knowledge. Many have been murdered, even by court execution orders, for apostasy. More still have been called idiots, since this is the only conclusion that the ordinary person can reach about the behavior which is linked with something beyond. How could such a phenomenon not produce a mass of jokes? Intention. There was once a Sufi who found himself in a large mass of people milling about outside the palace of the king of his country. The king had ordered that all the famous people of his realm were to be assembled and odes recited in their honour. The court poets had been working for months to get their verses ready, and this was the day of the great gathering of honour. The royal guards separated the guests from the onlookers, but the Sufi began to say, "I don't want to be praised, I don't want to be honoured, I don't want an ode in homage to me to be recited." This, however, was to no avail, for the guards hustled him into the audience chamber. He was struggling so hard, others only resisted from locally conventional modesty, that the king ordered him to be seated next to the throne. Then the king ordered the king of poets to recite the ode in honour of this most modest of men. The poem was nowhere to be found. They asked the sage his name, but nobody could remember who he was, if anyone. Finally, the king asked him to say something. He said, "I do not want to be praised." "Why not?" demanded the king. "If you didn't want to be praised, you should not have come to the reception." "But I didn't come. Your guards picked me up in the street. I wasn't invited. All I was doing was saying that I did not want to be praised." The Sufi is an idiot to the outward man. The other is an oaf to the Sufi. The second seldom persists in dealing with the Sufi, luckily, which gives the latter a greater chance of teaching those who can learn than he would otherwise have. The Sufi will persist, coming back to the point again and again, because he knows that his jokes and other techniques are generally laying down a basis of understanding, which will eventually amount to a sound seedbed. The following tale is employed both to illustrate the doctrine of time, place, and people, and also to encourage the hearer, who may be able to conceive that his understanding may be weak, but that it may also develop. He is, of course, the first disciple of the tale. The fact that the Sufi has, in the story, accepted him at all is the point of hope that his obtuseness will eventually yield to something worthwhile. Deduction. A certain sage had 2 disciples. The first one was very argumentative, and the second silent. Day after day, week in, week out, for year upon year, the first disciple answered the wise man back, refused to obey his orders, misunderstood what was said to him, badgered him for teachings and explanations, and generally made life most uncomfortable. Finally, after a number of years, the old teacher walked into a room where the disciples were sitting with a friend, pointed his finger at the silent disciple, and the man was instantly illuminated. "Now look at that," said the visitor. "If you had heeded the sage like the silent one did, things might have been different." "Oh, not on your life," answered the awkward customer. "The sage may have gone into action at last, but who softened him up?" How to tell. People are always saying things like, "How can I become a Sufi without a teacher? After all, lots of famous ones did." You have to give them a memorable illustration which will fix the contention that circumstances alter cases. A joke like the following one will help, not because it is strictly relevant in the sense of being a parable or parallel, but because the amusement engendered helps to operate on a similar level to the other person's expectation. Ducks. A traveller went up to a peasant and asked whether he could wade through a certain stream. The man assured him that he could. When he was less than halfway across, however, the man found his head almost under water, and he had to trudge back to the bank, where the countryman was still sitting. "I thought you said that the water wasn't too deep for me to cross, you fool," he shouted. "Can't make it out, you know," said the yokel. "It never comes more than halfway up the ducks." But if the student can learn to see himself as essentially a yokel in the land of the Sufis, how can he also know whether he is in that land or not? Which teacher is a true one, which is a fraud or himself self-deluded? Sufis themselves have always provided innumerable stories for intending students. Most of them are based on the principle that the student must study the master to see by his words and actions whether he is working on a higher level or whether he is merely a social phenomenon. The objection to this, that the student cannot tell, since the master is working in an invisible realm, is true only up to a point. When a supposed Sufi teacher manifests ordinary foibles or weaknesses as a part of his life's pattern, and if the student has also done enough interior work to give him an accurate judging capacity, the truth will be evident. This is why the Sufis provide material, concurrently, on how to set aside prejudices and also on what unworthy teachers are like in their behavior. This is a good example. Gold for everyone. There was a certain mystical master teacher, or at any rate someone who thought he was one. The only difficulty was that he had no disciples. He harangued and behaved mysteriously, but nothing happened. One day he was complaining to a sort of wandering monk that he would give a silver piece for every disciple that the other one could bring in. "No problem at all," said the monk. "I have a lot of experience in these things. Let me have until tomorrow morning." Soon after dawn, the mystic awoke with the sound of thousands of people shouting his name as they collected on the town square. As he hurried out of his house to approach his eager audience, the monk stepped forward. "How was that?" "Marvelous, but I have to go and talk to them or they'll come here and drag me out to address them." "You owe me 3,000 silver pieces," said the monk, and would not let him go until he had them. As the monk was going off, the mystic said, "Well, I'm made now. Thank you. But what did you tell them about me to get that degree of enthusiasm for mystical secrets at this time of the morning?" "It was quite easy, really. I told them all how wonderful you were, and that you would give out bags of gold in the town square at dawn." It should also be remembered, especially by those who want a tidy world, with the sacred and profane neatly labelled and visible in neat institutions, that false teachers unwittingly provide an excellent social service for the true ones. Like attracts like, and those who want sensationalism or stage orientals can have their fill and leave the serious workers alone as having insufficient attraction value. I am fond of this statement about the situation. Too late. An angel winged her way from celestial realms to attend to a certain matter on earth. As she was about to alight on the planet, she met another angel homeward bound to report. "What are you doing here?" asked the second angel. "I'm going to illuminate a certain mystic, who will now at last be promoted to high rank." "You are too late," said the returning angel. "He has already been made head of his own order of monks." It has not escaped the attention of some sociologists, if not many metaphysicians, that whole countries which have the reputation of being filled with spiritual people are only occupied by people who imagine that they are engaged in spiritual pursuits. There is an ancient tale which shows how widespread this has always been, even in the East, home of spirituality. Visitors. There was once a king who decided to treat everyone in prison more humanely. He ordained, among other things, that all convicts must have visitors, and his officers took the names of the towns and villages from which these people came to make announcements that they must visit such and such people to cheer them up and prepare them for eventual release. But there was one man who still never got any visitors. Finally, the prison governor called him. "You said that you have relatives and friends from such and such a village?" "Yes." "We have sent criers around the countryside proclaiming that it is the king's command that you be visited. Why will your own people not present themselves here for this humanitarian purpose and to fulfill the requirements of this royal decree? Probably because they are all convicts here already. There is very little that people can do for themselves when they belong to a community, sometimes it is a whole culture, which imagines that its social behavior is spiritual. Such people manage to escape when they can see the hypocrisy of outward show and the perceptive shallowness of the emotional, which they always call deep. From time to time, of course, this happens, and people sometimes wander from one mystical master to another until they discover what higher knowledge really is by elimination. The Limp. A man was limping as he walked down a street and wincing with pain. A doctor stopped him and said, "If I were you, I'd get yourself seen to. You need your appendix out." So he had his appendix out. Presently he went to another doctor, claiming that he still had the same trouble. So he was put on a course of tranquilizers. This didn't help, and he went to a hospital, where they prescribed him a diet and remedial exercises. Some weeks later he was strolling in the park and met one of his many doctors. "Glad to see you are better," said the physician, "and that I could be of service." "Service my eye," said the patient. "Both the pain and the limp went away the moment I took that nail out of my shoe." Scoffers may see this as a tale which exposes the absurdity of all forms of higher knowledge being veridical. We note, however, that it signals the emerging capacity to walk. What was the nail that the man took out of his shoe? The self-importance which the doctors had encouraged. It is a deeply rooted, and for short-term purposes useful instrument, but usually not a servant but a master. People will swear to it. "What is your occupation?" the judge asked Mullah Nasruddin when he was a witness in a court case. "I am the greatest man in the world," said the mullah. After the case, one of his friends said, "Nasruddin, why did you say that?" "Yes," said the mullah, "it is rather a pity, but I had to tell them just this once. I was on oath, you see." Among the jokes which are employed to display the structure of a situation is the one about the boatman and the traveller. Hold on. A traveller was crossing a very broad stretch of water when the boat began to rock, so he caught hold of the mast with both hands to prevent himself being swept overboard. While all this was happening, the boatman, who of course was used to this kind of motion, made his way hand over hand along a rope and asked him for his fare. "Certainly," said the traveller. "You just hold onto the mast like I am to keep me steady, and I'll get it out of my bag." The choice of interpretation of the tale tells us something about the person to whom we tell it. Some people think it means that teachers don't give adequate thought to their disciples. They expect them to do something which they cannot, though these things are easy to the teacher, who is, of course, the boatman in this case. Others say that this story shows that all disciples are foolish, since they imagine that someone can do something for them that they have to do for themselves. We regard this story as showing that there are many so-called mystical masters who are asking the disciple to do things which will, if they try to do them, sweep them away from real understanding, just as the storm would sweep away this passenger when faced by the idiotic demand of the boatman. He may be a boatman, but he does not necessarily know the real pattern of events. Sea legs do not go with intelligence.